8 terrifying stories of skinwalkers. Every culture has scary stories about mysterious beings, and Native Americans are no exception. The Navajo legend of the skinwalker is particularly chilling because so many individuals claim to have had real-life encounters with the skinwalker in the present day. Tap at the window. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, give or take 5 miles per hour, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tap tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to say a prayer in the morning, so evil will forget our faces." From Navajo to English equivalent. I recall curling up in my seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time. To my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit. He said, "I didn't see faces. Just my eyes. Like the brake lights you see on the road. It watched you." From Navajo to English equivalent. Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter. Just a pause. "Because it wasn't alone. Don't get off the bus." Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either heard of some creepy things or has experienced pretty creepy things, namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here is my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S.'s largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school, being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo res. And we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put the teams up in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just gotten done playing our game and were headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out, and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving, before we had to enter the res. By this time everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles per hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles per hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, except that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes reflect light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, holy crap, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept pace with the bus, hurling sagebrush and rocks while staring at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The skinwalker just smiled at me with this inhuman smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked, yellow, pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the whole ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumple down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds, he was now a coyote and he ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing, turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker. It might be due to the fact that I moved away from that town and and if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around, stay away from ruins of the Inquisition. This all happened about 5 years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided, after a night of hanging out, that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruin in New Mexico that was once the seat of the Inquisition. For the life of me, I can't remember what the place is called. So we jumped through the front gate into the place and start exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him and he started playing it, and about 30 seconds into his mediocre playing, something started screaming really loudly on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quickly, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. We noped the fuck out of there. One of my friends pissed in his pants and drove for a few hours to Bandelier National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got to Bandelier at probably like 6 or 7 a.m. and set up our camp. After a few hours just talking about what the hell happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss, probably only 300 feet from our camp. This is where everything starts to get a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming my way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but follow them, like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These weren't my friends, they had bright red hair, like my friends' faces, and cat eyes. Both of these friends were brunettes. I stopped walking and they looked at me with probably the most terrifying gaze I've ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I came from. After like 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to that rock that I pissed at and found our camp. Everyone was there, still sitting around talking, and didn't even notice that I was gone. I told them what happened with the lookalike skinwalkers and we packed up everything and left, probably within 10 minutes, and got the hell back to Albuquerque. Say their name and it will kill them. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone was moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, it opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. In the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away, tucking itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed them over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was, they didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that when the headlights hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed away. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. It nearly got him and his brother. This is my father's story, written from his perspective. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and stone. It's a lot like our house now. It was two of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to the James feast and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep, and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow I was able to get to sleep for a few hours. Then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, save for my brother's snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlights to the outhouse. The dogs began their crazed barking in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first, and I waited outside for him. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs. Then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year. Not even the sheep were making noise. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs barking completely madly at the truck. When I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little while, and then suddenly kicked one of them. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, two burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk toward me with long strides, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was going on. I also noticed these things with long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and he smelled like a bloated dead animal in the summer. As I was still unable to move or speak, the skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed. As I was, closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm out toward my brother's head. Something finally snapped in me, and I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angrier at the thing that was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more the smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran away into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile long since gone. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. A mysterious legend encounters Mormon missionaries. While trading stories around a campfire, my friend recalled an encounter he had while serving an LDS mission. My friend's mission region had a reservation within its boundaries. However, it was relatively far from where he was serving. On one occasion, him and his mission companion were asked to travel further than usual to meet with some investigators. This took them near the reservation. On their way home, their car ran out of gas, and it wasn't until late at night that they were able to continue the journey home. My friend, who was driving while his companion slept in the passenger seat, chose a different route that took him through some back roads in an attempt to get home sooner. He told us he was driving above the speed limit when he noticed movement in the woods lining the road. Because coyotes were common in the area, he took little notice at first. Then he looked out the window and slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop jolted his companion awake, who immediately wanted to know what was wrong. My friend was shaken and said he would tell him once they got home. He asked him to say a prayer. By the time they made it home, his companion was dying to know what had happened. My friend told him. I looked down at the road next to the car and saw 6 men running on all fours, keeping up with the car. I was driving 40 miles an hour. An attack on a party van. Whenever my mom would take us on a road trip to her hometown on the Navajo reservation, I'd occasionally ask her to tell me a skinwalker story along the way. I remember every story she told me was when we were driving through miles of nothing at night. Luckily, nothing ever happened to us during those drives. Anyway, this is one of those stories, and it came from my auntie. So my auntie and some of her friends used to party a lot back in the day. They'd hop in a beaten down van, drive out to the boondocks, and just drink and have fun. Of course, this all took place on the Navajo reservation after sunset. On this particular night, that's what they were doing. Everything was going swimmingly until they heard what sounded like rocks being thrown at their van. Everyone gets quiet as they wonder what the hell is going on. The sounds of rocks being thrown stop, and then suddenly, something jumps on top of the van roof. I should mention my family owned a white van that we would use for road trips because it had enough room for all my brothers and me. So imagine young me being told this story in a van. Everyone starts panicking as the realization sets in and hurries to lock all the doors. My auntie jumps in the driver's seat and tries to start the engine. Of course, the beaten down van then refuses to start. Whatever is on the roof is still up there making a banging noise at this point, like it's jumping up and down. My auntie is freaking out when she sees a hand with long nails reach over the roof and start scratching the windshield. At this point in the story, my mom would take one hand off the steering wheel and scratch the windshield to simulate it. Then whatever was on the roof leaps to its death. Everyone is still freaking out, yelling at my auntie to start the van, and she keeps trying. That's when she sees the skinwalker walk up to the driver's side window and stare at her from just a few inches away. Well, that's when my auntie jumped in the back and started praying for her life. Minutes pass, and the skinwalker appears to be leaving. My auntie hops back in the driver's seat and gets the van to start, and off they go. The creature had a human face. My roommate has told me this story a few times, and I want to see if anyone else has had similar experiences. As he tells it, he was driving home super late at night, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m. in a suburb of Phoenix, us both times that this occurred. The first time he was driving alone on a road that had an open field to the left of it when, out of nowhere, a black figure on all fours bounded up out of the field and across the road in front of his car. As soon as the figure gets to the other side of the road, it stops with inhuman quickness, turns around, and looks directly at my roommate. He described the figure as looking simian, completely black except for the face. The creature's face was a stark white human face. Not white as in Caucasian, but white as snow. This happened again a few weeks later, but this time the creature was sitting in a tree. As his car approached, it climbed down the tree, again with inhuman quickness, bounded across the road, stopped on a dime, turned around and made eye contact with him. This time he had a friend in the car who also saw it and began freaking out. It was the same exact thing as the first time, a simian black body with a snow-white, expressionless human face. My roommate, ever the curious one, turned the car around and began searching for the creature, but it was nowhere to be seen.